Hi, my name is Anjali and this is my TOK exhibition. In this investigation, I'm going to be answering the question, are certain types of knowledge more up to interpretation than others? And we're going to look at three different objects that answer this question. The first object that I have chosen is the periodic table. I'm sure everyone's heard of it. The periodic table is commonly used in the sciences to analyze trends and relationships between the various elements on the table. Sciences like chemistry and physics focus on the interconnectedness of the molecules and their consequent dependencies on each other. This object is particularly intriguing for this investigation because it demonstrates the way that knowledge changes over time, in turn changing the way that it's interpreted. The natural sciences is an area of knowledge, and the periodic table falls into that. In the past, the periodic table had empty spots and was grouped differently from modern day, and it suggests that the interpretation of the periodic table was open for scientists to make their own assumptions and create versions depending on their perspective of the elements. The discovery of subatomic particles in 1913, however, allowed scientists to group the elements based on their atomic number. This discerning of the atomic number made the knowledge more concrete and solidified the scientists' grouping of the elements. This grouping leaves only a very little bit up to interpretation, but still leaves some spots in the table for elements that may be found later. But now it changes into modern day. The modern construction of the periodic table is based on new knowledge of the elements and their individual makeup. The interpretation of the periodic table is determined by the position of the elements on the table when previously it was dependent on the viewpoint of the scientists. Like shown with the periodic table, scientific knowledge is left up to the interpretation of the beholder until solid evidence is found, creating a structure to follow and a methodology that is supposedly correct. Scientific knowledge that has been proven multiple times by a variety of scientists is a good example of knowledge that is not left up to interpretation and is widely accepted. The second object in my investigation is cumulus clouds over Tulsa, Oklahoma. This is a picture taken from a main fairground in the city and is commented on by many people from the Tulsa region in a blog post. The perception of an object or pattern where there is actually nothing is called pareidolia, and this occurrence is common when people perceive shapes in the clouds. In this photo, the clouds create a multitude of shapes like an airplane, a pufferfish, an even wider variety that varies from person to person. I chose this image to fit into this investigation because it's a really good example of an image that changes over time. The shapes that are seen in the clouds are dependent on the varying life views of the people and the things that they've experienced. This relates to the nature of knowledge and the culture and context of someone's life. Their life context determines their interpretation of the clouds and the meaning that they are going to contribute to them. This is a really good example of availability bias, where a person who interprets the clouds sees something because of the information and experiences that are available to them. Consequently, the knowledge that is gained is going to be tainted by the interpretations of the objects. The nature of knowledge is that it varies greatly from person to person. This type of dynamic knowledge that is dependent on individual viewpoints is more up to interpretation than the scientific knowledge in the periodic table that we talked about before, due to the impact that a person's individual experiences will have. The malleable nature of the clouds in the sky, compounded with the different worldviews, makes this type of knowledge more up to interpretation than the others. My third object is Braille. This alphabet is used by blind people and people who are unable to see clearly, and it allows them to function independently and is considered an official language. It works like a written language but has beads that are methodically numbered in different patterns to create various sounds and letters. These dots are felt through the fingertips and are very specifically placed, and there's a really specific method to read it. A language, like Braille, is part of the human sciences, an area of knowledge. Braille is not up to the interpretation of the individual and relies on memorization and relates to psychology. Much like the basics of the alphabet being taught in elementary school, the alphabet in Braille is unchanging and stays consistent throughout time. This area of knowledge can have differences in the method that things are understood, but the interpretation as the Braille is read through touch will not change. There are a variety of levels of Braille starting from grade 1, advancing into higher levels with more complex bead patterns. Like with this area of knowledge, this variety will not affect the overall meaning of the board. People who know higher levels of Braille will feel the younger level Braille is easy, but they will not interpret the letters differently than any other person would. Therefore, this image is involved in the investigation because it's a really great example of an object that does not change based on person. The life experiences that someone goes through will not affect the way that they interpret the Braille language, and regardless of level, the language will mean the same thing. This means that the Braille language and this area of knowledge are less up to interpretation than the clouds from the picture that we saw before. Thank you, and please fill out my form.